13 Sentinels is really a unique game. And going into this review when I started playing back in September was unlike anything else I'd really kind of come across as someone who's been reviewing games, covering games, or just podcasting for a really long time. And what makes Vanillaware's latest epic so interesting is that my biggest takeaway from when it was all said and done is that I have almost as many things to praise as I do to critique about it. And one thing I really want to emphasize going into this review is that I highly, highly, highly recommend you play this game first before watching or listening to this review. I'm not really going to be going over beat by beat story spoilers and things like that, but I'm definitely going to have some sort of takeaways talking about the game. And 13 Sentinels is just such a weird game to review without spoiling anything, is to basically sell the game short, and by then diving deeper into what the game is about, you're kind of ruining the experience for anyone who plays it. So, for this review, I kind of want to split it up into two things similar to the game. I want to start by talking about the main characters you play as through the adventure mode, and then we're going to finish this by talking about gameplay, and then final thoughts. Okay, so first off, I just have to say this. I cannot believe that this game has not one, not five, but 13 playable characters, and the craziest thing about them all is that, with the exception of one, I found myself not only falling in love with all of these characters, but like learning about them in ways that I never thought I'd be so intrigued by. Someone who might seem like a generic stereotype or something else like that. They really find interesting and new ways to evolve as characters, for the most part. And it's just such a testament to this game that I remember when I started looking at all 13 of the playable characters, I was like, okay, I'm probably going to remember like one or two of you all. But like the fact that after spending something like 40 hours platinuming the game, I now feel like I have such a wealth of knowledge for all of the characters: Jiro, Iori, Shu, Keitaro, Natsuno, Yuki, Tomi, Nenji, Takatoshi, Megumi, Ryoko, A, and Renya. And not even just with the main characters, but even the side characters, I have to give just so much praise to making this world really feel fleshed out and developed, when it's really funny of like, on the surface, this game just kind of looks like, okay, Japanese teenagers in the 80s with robots and kind of time travel. But it's really funny, the further you get into this game, it somehow finds a way to get more grandiose in scope and concept, and yet actually it ends up getting smaller and smaller the closer you get to the end. And I mean, just thinking about, like, you start this game in a city of over 1 million people in 1985, and then next thing you know, you're ending the game on a remote planet millions of years in the future, and all you're left with is the 13 characters you were playing throughout this entire game. Before I start really getting into what I thought of each of the playable characters, there's one thing I kind of wanted to talk about in terms of the game's primary story mode. And I've heard a lot of kind of conflicting things, ranging from, oh, it's a visual novel, it's an adventure game. And one of the interesting things that this game's main story is told through are basically just vignettes between characters and settings. There's very, very few moments of like kind of grandiose scales. It's like you're in a school hallway, you're in a street, or you're like a back alley or someone's house, no matter what the time is or the place. And what's so interesting is, like, it never really feels so big. It never really feels like it's so big that you're going to get lost or not sure what to do, give or take a couple of moments that are kind of like puzzles. But at the same time, the control is so reliant on you going up, finding things. Basically, it almost kind of is like its own amalgamation of, it's part visual novel in the fact that it is primarily you just listening or reading text, and then your actual interactions are where the adventure game part sort of comes in, because by talking to these characters, you're gaining new thoughts in your thought bubble, and by certain thought bubbles you can either consider or talk to other people about them, and this progresses the story. Now, when you're going through each one of the 13 characters' different stories, you can kind of open up this giant timeline, and at first it's going to seem a lot more daunting than it is. It's going to seem like one of those things of, oh my gosh, A, am I going to have to repeat this a million times, or B, is it just going to be like a bunch of stuff I'm going to miss out. And thankfully, you never really end up missing out in terms of the stuff that you could do. It just, the way you get around it is usually up to the player. So let's just say, in a example, I would be Juro, and maybe I want to start the day by talking to Tomi or Miwako, but instead the game is like, okay, well, let's have you talk to Shiba-kun. Obviously, if you're going to get to the ending of this game, you're going to have to look at all of those different outcomes, so it's going to happen one way or the other, so you have a little bit of control, and I think for the most part, it's really interesting. The only place it kind of left me wanting more is that there were certain times where I wish it would have more clearly examined that, saying, hey, even though I'm starting on the roof again as Yuki, it doesn't necessarily mean that time has gone back exactly. Sometimes things have gone back and you're starting over fresh with new ideas, like with certain characters, but then others, it's clearly, I'm the same character and this is the same location, but time has progressed because other characters are acknowledging what I had done in my previous run of their story. Now, that's just really basic overview of the basically adventure mode part of the story, and for the most part I really liked it. The characters, the backgrounds, I mean, oh my gosh, like if you are even just looking at this game, the 2D art that they went into, even though this is a Vanillaware game, is just so great on so many levels. Even the background characters, or things that you would think wouldn't really be that much important in terms of how much art and care is put into this, but it is really like they spent a large amount of time fleshing out this world, making it feel real, and really just making you feel like, hey, like, even though you're seeing a whole bunch of generic no-name NPCs, it's still interesting to watch them walk by, see the different character designs, and yes, you're going to see a couple repeat, and a lot of them might share different walking animation cycles, and they're basically as important to the world as any NPC is to a story. It's just basically interesting to see how much love and attention went into something even as frivolous in most games as background art or background characters. Now, speaking of characters, I just want to go through each one of the 13 characters and just kind of give my personal opinion on what I thought of them or what I thought of their story. And it's so interesting that, like, even doing just 13, it might seem like a lot, but in my head, it's like, after beating this game, it's like one character isn't just one character. Yes, each character is their own being with their own opinions and story, but even Juro, who we're going to talk about first, talking about Juro Karabe, the high schooler, is so much more different than even just saying, oh, I want to talk about Juro Izumi. And maybe not even Juro Izumi. I want to talk about Juro Izumi from one loop ago, or 2 loops ago, or even the original Juro Izumi from 2188. And it just dives into this whole thing of, oh my gosh, like, so many more things I kind of want to talk about. A lot of that is definitely less so prevalent for a review, but just interesting to say of, like, this is the characters who are really the focal point of the story. So without further ado, let's start off with our first character, and far from the titular character. I would say, honestly, all of these characters share equal amounts of screen time throughout the entirety of the story. But first up, we have Juro Karabe. Juro Karabe he's very interesting. When you first see him as a character, he is pretty much your stereotypical, I'm a movie otaku film buff, and I might have a crush on a girl, I'm not really sure, but his story progresses in such an interesting way of, like, each time you think, oh, that's the interesting hook, it keeps diving deeper and deeper, even though Juro probably has one of the most, probably tied with Iori, of interesting character background that's probably way more interesting than their actual character. But Juro Karabe in this game specifically, I thought was so interesting, not only as a fellow movie fan, just kind of watching how he sort of processed his love of movies with his friends and whatnot, but also just how he handled the other things of slowly coming to the realization of he's not really who he is, and the world he's living is not actually all that it might seem. And I think the game does a really good job of not only kind of showing us that by playing him, but also the characters it lets us spend time around him with. And the big one I really want to give a super big shout out to is Shiba-kun. Now, Shiba is, as we find out later in the game, multiple characters. Shiba is Juro Izumi from 2 loops ago. He is also Fluffy the cat, and various other androids along the way there. But what was so interesting about Shiba-kun in particular is once you've seen the whole context of the story, Shiba-kun's job is not just to, oh, I'm here to make Jiro Karabe turn back into Jiro Izumi, which that might be why his story got started. It's just so interesting of, no, it's about these two different Jiros having to find a way to cope and live together. So going back into Jiro Izumi, Jiro Karabe only exists because Jiro Izumi basically had such terrible effects done to him by being in the Sentinels, which are these giant robots all the protagonists end up playing through the game. But what was so interesting about that is that Jiro having to become Karabe, I appreciated never actually being like a negative. Jiro Izumi turning into Jiro Karabe, outside of Megumi, obviously, since she is so head over heels in love with Jiro at the time as Izumi and not Jiro Karabe. For the rest of the world, it's not really that big of a deal, and one of the most interesting things about this game is that the more you discover about these characters, especially I think once you discover that all of the main cast you're playing as is clones, and not only clones, but clones of people so many million years ago in the past that, like, they might look like them, but that doesn't mean they're always going to act like them. And that definitely comes up again with Shu and other people will sort of talk about, which I think is so interesting because the idea of clones in science fiction is far from anything kind of new or special, but I really, really appreciated that this game kind of did its own thing in the sense of, hey, we have clones, but they're not just going to be like the same person. And the way I mean about that is, I think it would have been really lazy if Jiro's whole character arc is, I start as Jiro Karabe, and I finally become Jiro Izumi again at the end of the day. And Jiro's character arc is probably one of the most simplistic in the grand scope of things, mainly just to the fact of, by the end of it, he's still Karabe at the end of the game, but he still finds a way to love Megumi through learning about the events that happened prior to his memory loss, and obviously all the stuff that they went through to get to the end of the game. So I really enjoyed, for Jiro's character specifically, how we could kind of let Karabe and Izumi, whether it be the real one or the clones, be their different people. And that was just one of those really special moments that I thought, okay, that's really interesting, especially it's a lot easier to sort of explain that with Izumi being so many different people. But that's kind of my rambly take on why I really liked Jiro, and I think while he's probably far from being my favorite, I just enjoyed his archetype a lot more than it definitely seemed at first. On the polar opposite of things, unfortunately, Iori Fuyusaka I really did not like. And I feel like I have to put a million different asterisks or caveats with this. So, my biggest problem with Iori is that everyone around her has a better story and is more interesting than her, even when she's directly involved with things. And it becomes way more apparent when you kind of look at everyone's story in terms of what it really added to the overall experience. And what was so funny about this for me, I didn't really realize I hated Iori's character arc until her story finished. And I'll never forget this. Iori's character moment in the story before the final battle, it ends with her summoning her Sentinel and saying, I'm not just a schoolgirl anymore. I'm a schoolgirl with a giant robot. And I let out such a giant sigh of disappointment, frustration, of just like, this is just so lazy. Like, the writing was just so dumb, and like, her whole arc primarily went around spending time with Tomi and Miwako, basically just to eat food, kind of remember who A-kun is, and basically that was kind of it. She never really got that into everything around her, which is way more interesting, because one of the interesting things about Iori's character is that Iori is actually the clone of Chihiro Morimura, which will get way more complicated as we talk about how many different clones and who's who. But it was just so frustrating to me that while playing through Iori's story, she very rarely deals with the consequences of the school nurse, who is Morimura-san, is also her from a different loop ago, and that she is a clone very rarely comes up into her story of who the original. For example, Chihiro, who Iori is cloned after, is the reason that humanity has died off back on Earth. And there are so many different things that they kind of dip into with the looped version of Chihiro, but with Iori, it just seems sort of swept under the rug of, okay, her story is to figure out what's kind of going on with her love life, and then to get into the final battle. And very rarely kind of matters besides that. So, Iori is a character, I hate that I don't like her, and that's only just because I think the Chihiro of 2188 is so interesting in terms of what a difficult and hard life she had, let alone with dealing with being responsible for this deadly virus due to the nanomachines, even with involving things like having a son finding out later with Okino-kun. So, really would have been nice to get a little bit more of that, but at the same time, you do get that in the form of Keitaro's little sister, Chihiro, being the reincarnated professor of 2188. Well, at the end of the day, it is disappointing. I have to admit, Iori is easily the worst character in the whole game for me, in terms of at least the main 13. Next up, I could not be doing way more of a 180. Shu Amaguchi is just such an interesting character path, not only in the terms of who you think he is at the start of it, of being the rich kid who all the girls like, and his prologue kind of ending with him talking to Miyuki Inaba, the idol in the TV. But the way it progresses in terms of him coming to grips with, yes, I'm Shu Amaguchi, but I also have to deal with the fact that I'm actually a clone of Ida. And the more we learn about Ida, and also how he's related to Tomi, and then what he's done that's led to everything going on in his current life, let alone the actual Ida-kun, which is going around, still acting as an entity, doing his own things for the SIU, I think it was just so great of Shu's story. It has so many nice ebbs and flows, ranging from he knows that he has a history because of him being Ida with Shinonome-kun. He also is aware of stuff with Tomi, even though he might not know specifically why he feels like he has feelings for Tomi. One of the things I actually really like about Shu and Yuki's relationship is that there's never that moment of, okay, I love you and I'm going to forgive you for the way you act now. And that also goes all the way up until the very end of Shu, from the beginning of his story all the way to the end in the future, is the same character. He never has a moment of being like, oh wow, I am Ida, I should be more like this. He's a completely different person. He, even learning that he is based off Ida as a clone, never really lets him affect his core character, which I just always thought was super, super great. While also having his own character flaw moments of he probably flirts too much or just other things like that. Next up, in terms of characters who probably ranks really, really high in terms of my favorite, is Keitaro Miura. Keitaro Miura is so interesting in the sense of when you're playing through his story is when you really start getting the first sort of drippings of 2188. And as a character, I think he gets one of the best settings. I think that Keitaro and Takatoshi easily have one of the best settings of 1945. Unfortunately, World War II doesn't really get explored all that much, and while I think that's fine, at its core, Keitaro is such a World War II fan even in the year 2188. I wish we would have had a little bit more time to sort of talk about, hey, what is World War II like for this young child in the army? Like, what is it really like of him being in the training? Like, just the fact that you don't even find out really about Keitaro's scar until you figured out other people's stories is a little bit disappointing, and I think it would have been more interesting to kind of have flashbacks as opposed to him just telling people, oh, I had this surgery so that I could control the Sentinel, because his scar plays a pivotal role in terms of not only his character, but like even just the way he presents himself. He's always hiding his forehead, not really out of shame, but more of he doesn't want to disgust people, because, I mean, if you had a giant scar on your forehead, I think the last thing you'd want is to be showing it off to everybody. But another really important part of Keitaro's story is kind of split in between two characters. The first one being his future, I guess, and also past self in the form of BJ, who is an artificial intelligence of Keitaro, who was used to pilot the Sentinels. And BJ is also the link between the next character we're going to talk about. And I'm just going to loop into this. with Natsuno-chan. Natsuno is a track team member of 1985, and her character arc is very similar to Karabe in terms of she's really interested in extraterrestrials. She has a really big passionate friend group in the form of Yuki and Tomi, but she's also on the track team. And even though she has all of these things going on in her life, as soon as she stumbles across BJ, who she thinks is an alien, it just totally uproots her whole life of like, okay, I am making it my mission to help BJ complete his mission, even though she has no idea who he is. He might be an alien. She knows that he's being hunted by men in black suits. And they just have such a wholesome story that leads to so many interesting places of Natsuno going from the 80s all the way back to World War II and meeting the now Keitaro with BJ, and just reflecting on everything once you've finished their stories, because Natsuno is one of those great characters who really gets to spend a good amount of time not only in the 80s but also the 40s with World War II, and even in the ruined future of the post-2000s. So Natsuno just had like a really, really great character arc. My only complaint with her, if I had to have one, is I would have liked a little bit more revelations in terms of her coming to grips with BJ being Keitaro. That definitely feels like something that kind of happens in the 5-year time skip from the beginning of the game to the end. But that's more of just me being a fan of both of those characters and kind of hoping for that moment, because it's just one of those kind of fan moments of like, the story's not losing anything for cutting that out, but it would have just been interesting to see how that really progresses. Alright, so next up is Yuki Takamiya. Yuki is such an interesting one for me I really, really appreciated her character arc, not only of kind of making her have to solve a mystery, and I mean the game even very clearly says this with the Sherlock Holmes analogies, but I just thought it was so interesting of even just taking that little story of her being in charge of finding out, okay, I need to find Natsuno, she's missing, and going on all the cases of investigating people, who was where, what happened in the bathroom, why are there two Tomi Kisaragis. I think Yuki is one of those really, really great characters of no matter whose story you're looking at, whether it be hers or she's involved with other people's stories, she really sort of shines in terms of she's one of those just really honest and wears her heart on her sleeve characters, which I always found so endearing. I have so many highlights of her being investigated with the police chief, Onishi. I especially like the budding relationship that she has with Shu, in the form of them finding that the city is actually a closed-off environment. And she just has so many great moments, and she's one of the actually few characters I would actually say is more interesting as a clone than her 2188 version. And I think most of the characters are probably in the opposite boat of so many characters I kept wanting to learn more and more and more about 2188. But I think the more you realize this game is about the present in terms of the cast and characters, and less so about the past, the more you'll kind of enjoy it. Now, next up we have Tomi Kisaragi. Tomi Kisaragi, when you're playing her, it goes through so many interesting movements as a character of she's coming from a future that has been lost and is going back in time and is having to adjust with the setting, not only of losing her family and friends, but she comes to the past with Megumi, but slowly starts making a new friend group with Iori and Miwako. I think her story like that is really, really interesting, but I think it gets such a boost in terms of the depth of it when they all get sent to the future. And what I mean they all do, I'm talking about the scene where Shinonome, Tomi, Nenji, and Miwako all get sent to 2025. That's one of the really, really great moments in the story of just something totally out of their hand. Everyone who could be able to do something is either incapacitated or they just have no idea what they're doing. I would have appreciated it kind of feeling a little bit more dire, similar to when Natsuno is sent to the future for a couple of days. She is even commenting about like, oh, I'm down to like my last rations of food or drink. You don't really ever feel that presence with the four of them being stuck in the future. They're like, oh, hey, found some more candy or found some more drinks and stuff like that. So I would have appreciated it to be a little bit more dire, but Tomi is very, very interesting in the sense of, especially when you learn more about her, her character gets so much more interesting, not only Not even really only getting into the fact of current Tomy, but learning about previous loops Tomy, and then the reincarnated AI version, which we now know is the idol Miyuki Inaba. Okay, next up we're going to talk about another best boy candidate, which easily has to go to Ninji Ogata. Ninji Ogata, I remember seeing him at the start of someone's story and thinking, okay, we have the classic 80s pompadour guy, and he's got nothing really going for him. Nothing was really shouting out to me. Nothing was like, okay, what's going to make his character interesting? And I remember after then getting into Tomi's story and seeing how Nenji was sort of slowly falling for Tomy, and was definitely far from your stereotypical bully in the sense of Ninja is not the strongest guy in the world. He gets beat up just as many times as he beats up other people, but he has just got such a ironclad sense of justice that he has ever since he was a kid. I really appreciated. On top of the fact that we have to talk about Ninja's story is literally just live, die, repeat, but with a train. And I appreciated that so much. His story was so interesting in the sense of, listen, every time we're looping, like actually looping, of like, if you mess this up, you die, or we have to restart over the loop. And learning all about that in terms of, okay, why is he looping? What's the key? Why does this specifically matter? And then kind of adding up all of those previous loops together into the final one. And just the way that it all comes together and ends is just such a satisfying feeling of, you really feel like you're working out a puzzle, not only in terms of getting Ninja out of the situation, but also making sure that no one else gets hurt in the meantime, which is just so appropriate for who the character is. Now, next up, I've been thinking about this really long and hard, and I think Takatoshi Hijiyama might be my favorite character in the whole game. And it's really interesting because on the surface, Hijiyama-kun really seems like I'm a meathead from World War II. I got sent to the future. I kind of am looking for one person, but I don't really have that much going for me. Like, his whole story at the beginning definitely seems sort of like, okay, guy from the past gets caught up in something larger than he is, and then gets sent to the future and has to basically be, I guess, 40 years later in Encino Man, for a very dated reference. And while it's so funny to just look at his character as, oh, it's the yakisoba guy, he's always talking about yakisoba, the moments that really made me love Hijiyama is him coming to realization with what Okino-kun meant to him. Now, Okino-kun and him meet, and you get to see their first meeting of them all the way back in World War II. But what's so great is him sort of coming to terms with not only the fact that when he met Okino, he thought that Okino was actually a woman, that him revealing himself to be a man, there's never that, like, oh, gross, you're a guy, or, oh my gosh, like, I can't like a guy, like, that's weird, or even just being like, well, he's still cute even though he's a guy in a skirt or whatever. It never became that. It was very clearly their relationship just was so special to him. Gender never really mattered that much, but there are moments of him having to talk about it. Like, obviously, he's a man from 1945 in his head, and the idea of two men falling in love with each other is just such a foreign concept to him, but he never pushes it away like it's wrong. He pushes it away because of the things that Okino does, and to be fair, Okino does lie to him when they first meet, so it only makes sense. But just watching their relationship blossom from 1945 into the beginning of the final battle, I just thought was so perfect for me, just in the sense of, I loved watching their relationship grow. I loved how it really ended in the sense of him having to learn about, like, it was so heartbreaking learning with Hijiyama about the 2188 version of himself dying after getting revenge for Jiro shooting Okino. And just that moment of, he wasn't shocked that he was in love with Okino. He wasn't shocked that Jiro shot Okino. He wanted to make sure that Okino was safe and find him as quickly as possible. Just stuff like that I thought was so great. Next up, we have Megumi, who has got to be one of the weirdest story arcs of until you're really close to the end, Megami's story is just so weird. It is a high school girl from the future who gets moved from 2025 to 1985 and is pretty much a loner. She is forcing herself to live at Juro's house, even though he is very kind of wary of her. This is a strange girl wanting to live with him who clearly has feelings for her, who clearly has feelings for him, but he's just got so many mixed emotions and everything is so crazy for him. But what's so funny is that Megami's story is at its core all about her love for Jiro and what she's willing to do, but is also her kind of coming to grips because she finds a mysterious talking cat named Fluffy who gives her a gun, and she is told to shoot this magical gun at all of the students who we later find out are the protagonists we've been controlling all the Sentinels with. And even as she finds out more and more about her actually shooting and injecting these nanomachines into all of the pilots, what's so interesting is kind of watching her never really falter until the very last moment of, I'm doing this for Jiro, I need to get my love back, because Fluffy says, if you do what I want, I'm going to give you the Jiro that you love back, because right now it's Jiro Karabe is a very different man than Jiro Izumi, who she fell in love with. And I think that's just one of those things that's just very relatable in the sense of, like, when you love someone, like, how far would you go? And Megami's story just has that interesting thing of, yes, she's not really hurting people, but she's not giving them the chance or choice of really having these nanomachines in them. But if it means she gets the love of her life back, she'll do anything, even if it means shooting herself with nanomachines. Next up, we have easily one of the most enigmatic characters in the story with Ryoko Shinonome. Ryoko is one of those characters that you have less of a good time playing, and it's more interesting to sort of see her perspective. Ryoko, you don't really get to learn all that much about outside of the fact that she's obviously been previously injured from some form of help with the Sentinels. She is in love with Ida-kun, and she is slowly kind of losing her mind without the help of these pills or stuff from Morimura. And her whole story, I think, kind of gets a pass, almost in the sense of she has an interesting story and a very pivotal role in the form of she's one of the reasons that the Daimos are attacking, in the fact that the 13 Sentinels have to take them all down at the end of it all. But I think just the way that they told her story in terms of, like, no, you really have to kind of manage each time you're playing as Shinonome of, when am I taking my pills, where can I go, how far can I make it without these pills, because you have a finite amount of them each time. And I just thought her story was really, really interesting, but she definitely sticks out for me of one I really wish we could have gotten, if not a better look at in terms of how Ida-kun really started using her, and specifically how her real version in 2188 ended up becoming so sick of humanity and getting driven to the point of, no, I'm going to sabotage all hope for this last-ditched effort to save humanity, and just basically stick it into this never-ending loop cycle of failure, failure, death, and failure. Next up, we have A. Sekigahara. Outside of having one of the most Blade Runner-ass names I've ever heard in a video game, A has a really, really great story in the sense that A has lost his memory, wakes up next to a dead Chihiro Morimura, and is not only working back the steps in terms of what happened, piecing it all together. Why is she dead? Why am I a hitman? How did I get here? And his story is just so great in the sense that it teaches you so much about these characters. You're learning more about DD426 and how this virus is not only corrupting yourself, but really how it got started. And it even does the thing of, like, I don't really like Iori Fuyusaka, but I love the relationship he has with her because he is aware that this is someone he was hired to kill at one point. But even with all of that knowledge, how the two of them sort of make a relationship work without it sort of feeling forced. And it was just one of those things of, I really, really appreciated it. You got just enough of who he was in 2188 to feel satisfied. He has an awesome, awesome, awesome flashback of showing him actually killing the original Chihiro Morimura. And I think he just has a really satisfying ending, not only in terms of explaining how he got there, how he lost his memory, but also where he's going in the future and really what's motivating him. Now, finally, we have probably the biggest enigma out of the entire cast, and even the game is aware of this. After you start Rinya Gota's prologue, you are no longer allowed to play him until you get everyone's story up to 80%. And that's very much so on purpose. The game knows that Gota-kun is very much in the weeds of this. He already has a lot of answers. And it was very satisfying kind of having that pulled off, because you never want a character to just be, I'm exposition man. And it would have been really, really kind of lame if Goto's whole character is, I have this notebook, and it shows me all the answers, and here's why I have all the answers. But instead, even though he does have probably the most exposition out of anyone's story, especially with Chihiro, I think it's really interesting that it goes through the steps of him learning where all this information, him going through these data logs, him learning about the Goto of 2188, and just going through all of the past and using it in all of its deductive reasoning to get to where they are in the future. He was just such an interesting character. My only complaint with Goto's story is I really wish we would have known what the heck was up with him falling in love with Chihiro. It's like, you find out later by him being basically called out of, like, I was in love with you, but he never had a moment that we were aware of where he was spending time with any form of Chihiro Morimura. He was never really fawning over Iori at all, and it was just one of those things of, like, I think there's something interesting there if you want to get into it, but him just sort of saying, oh, I've always loved Chihiro Morimura, just kind of fell flat, because at that point, Seki Kahara is in love with Iori Fuyasaka. Jiro Izumi is in love with Chihiro Morimura. And going back to the Professor one, it's like, okay, well, nothing of that was really sort of set up, especially from both of their original versions. So it basically would have just been really nice to have a little bit more explanation in the sense of, how does someone go from being in the year 2188 and sending out a hit order to Morimura, and now all of these years later, the clone version being in love with that same person? That's just something I'd really like to have dived a little bit deeper into. Okay, so working our way up into the gameplay after 9 hours of me talking about the characters, this game has such a weird problem with the fact that it wants to be a game. And I wish that wasn't the case, because with past Vanillaware titles, with Odin Sphere or Muramasa, even Grim Grimoire, and specifically Dragon's Crown, these games are just so flashy, beautiful, gorgeous, and are always such a delight, not only to play, but just to watch. And looking at the gameplay that I have in this video, and even over the 40 hours of me playing the game, I continued to be underwhelmed by the gameplay. Not because it was a strategy game, not because it had turn-based, not because it had tower defense elements. It was just one of those things of, it was never satisfying to play. It never felt like it added to the story, and the story that was wrapped inside of the gameplay always felt really shallow. Like, it felt like it was almost written by two separate teams. The people who had to make the story work in the battles, and the people who had to make the story works before the battle, just are so different in terms of their quality. It just really sticks out like a sore thumb. So if you're not aware, this game kind of plays like a strategy game in the form of, you can pick up to 6 characters that'll pilot the Sentinels. The Sentinels are fighting wave after wave after wave of daimos or kaiju, whatever you want to call them. They're basically giant robots, but hey, that doesn't really matter. You're fighting wave after wave of these enemies, and the robots, I think design-wise on paper, are fine. They're more interesting when you learn about the Sentinels themselves specifically. But the daimos and the kaiju specifically are so crazy. Their designs are really out there, and like, when you discover that the daimos are actually just construction machines, not only is that interesting and kind of adds to the lore of the world, it is just one of those things if you want to learn about more and like have them seem like a bigger, scarier presence. Unfortunately, the game decides that its entire gameplay presentation is pretty much in the form of like voxels or pixels, and while you're looking at the cityscape map, you're never looking at 3D renders or even 2D models fighting it out. It always just kind of feels like you're watching the simulated battle happening in front of you. It never really feels real, outside of, oh, here's someone's health, or here's how close you are to defeating the boss. That disconnect was just so hard for me to really get over in terms of caring about each battle and feeling like they really mattered or were very strenuous for any of the characters you were piloting. And I think that's just so disappointing because they go throughout the story talking about how big of a deal it is going into the Sentinels and fighting in battle. And I don't know if this was a budgetary thing, but I think it just led to one of those things of battles that are just not fun to watch, gameplay that is just not fun to play, and the story that holds it all together is, for the most part, really forgettable. Like, every now and then, at the start or end of a battle, you'll have bits of story that are interesting and might give you interesting lore for the world, whether it be, oh, what can this Sentinel do, or what does this Deimos do. A lot of it, especially towards the last third area, is, what? Goto dated Ryoko? It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, the stuff like this has no effect on the story. As cute as it is for a character to confess their love for someone else in the end of a battle, it's not progressing the plot. There's very low stakes. Like, throughout all of the 30 plus waves that you have to do to beat the game, there are 2 battles specifically that I remember really feeling any consequence to, and even though it wasn't difficult ever, even playing at any difficulty level, it at the very least felt high stakes at the final fight, but then made me reflect on the previous 30 and go, why weren't the rest this fun or the rest this challenging? Now, I will say, if you enjoy the gameplay of 13 Sentinels, there is a ton of replay value. I mean, they have a 4th area that has over 9,000 waves. Unfortunately, it's a whole lot of stuff to do with no incentive to do it. Outside of being able to level up your characters or your meta chips, what really left me curious about the Endless Wave mode is like, okay, why are you setting up these 9,000 plus battles and not having any other extra story at all? It would have been so interesting to see maybe every 10 or even 15 battles, oh, let's have a comment about, oh, what has things been like on the new planet? Like, it's been 5 years. Maybe there's a reason we're coming back to the simulation and wanting to practice. Unfortunately, with gameplay being such a down note for me, it's just really tough because, like, I wasn't having a bad time while playing it, but I never thought I was really having fun. And it didn't take away from the overall experience of the story, but I think if you were wanting to make such a grandiose game, having that vision sort of hit home with the gameplay, and even if it was like scaling back the battles, instead of it being hundreds of thousands of Deimos coming at these 6 pilots at once in battle, maybe give it a little bit of a smaller scale, but make each battle look more intense. Like, let's see those attack animations. Like, when you're about to use an attack, whether it be launching rockets or punching stuff or shooting laser beams, it has these animations, and it's like, these are great. Like, imagine actually seeing these attacks have effects on the city, like seeing the collateral damage going around you, as opposed to just seeing pixels mashing into other pixels. Like it has as much high stakes as watching a simulated game of Madden 94 in the year 2020. Now, sort of wrapping up my thoughts on the game, I want to sort of talk about what I think of this game. And going into it, I haven't read anyone else's reviews. I've not had a lot of people to really talk about their opinions with in terms of the game, mostly due to not a lot of people having bought this game, but hey, that's not on you. You're not the ones in charge of marketing this game. But the few people I have actually heard talk about this were saying that, oh, this is the best story I've ever seen, this is like a masterpiece, this is a brand new like level of storytelling for video games, and I just felt like I was missing something. Like, I don't think I'm this overly cynical person who can't enjoy stories, but while I was playing through this game, the more I kept learning about the story, I was waiting for that, whoa, mind-blowing moment, and it never hit me. And all the moments I was thinking back of that probably hit people those ways, I kept comparing to other games. Like, one of my biggest comparisons for 13 Sentinels is like, oh yeah, clearly the people of Vanillaware enjoyed the story of Horizon Zero Dawn. There are so many similarities between that, if not even other game series out there. Like, I know even Horizon wasn't the first to do that sort of storytelling, but I kept finding so many different things to compare it to in terms of oh, this is like that story, or okay, this is like that. And that sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier of you're definitely going to enjoy this game more if you just take it at face value of I am here for the story of these 13 high schoolers. These 13 high schoolers are what the story I want. And while that story is always resolved, like that, like their whole story is like, okay, hey, I get why you're here, I get what happens to you, and I get your motivations. The game totally succeeds on that. The problem is, it has such an interesting wrapper. I'm more interested in the wrapper than I am the actual piece of candy underneath it all. And what I mean by this is, like, I go back to learning about the characters from one or even two loops ago, and specifically I go back to the 2188 original cast. I want to know, like, I want a whole prequel about that spaceship. I want to know about what was going on Earth when this virus was taking over all of mankind and spreading and killing people like crazy. I want to know what that was like. I don't want it to just be like, oh, because mankind died, that's why there are clones in this artificial simulation. No, it's like, I kind of want to get both. Like, obviously, it doesn't take away from Jiro Karabe's story, but Jiro Izumi, at the end of the day, was a infinitely more interesting character for me, so it only seemed fair that I would want to learn more, and unfortunately, the game just never really seemed like it wanted to tell that story, and it was just sort of weird because, like, they found such interesting little breadcrumbs to kind of keep you going of, like, learning that Natsuno back in the day, her mom was Yuki, and things like that, of like learning who was dating or who was in a relationship and what it was like of like, oh, what was the relationship like between Okino and Hijiyama back then. You get these little tiny breadcrumbs that lead you to a trail that just takes you off on a totally different story, and I just kept feeling like, God, I love this story, I love these characters, I love everything about this, but all of these giant gaping questions I have are never going to get answered. Not through all of the text logs, not through any of the summaries, not even through any of the mystery files. Like, you're learning a little bit, but if it's not about that main story of them and all of the 13 pilots getting out of their pods, you don't really ever get that satisfying of a thing. And obviously, this might be one of those situations of maybe Vanillaware did not want me to have all the answers. Maybe Vanillaware was thinking this is more about the what happens as opposed to the how did this happen. And I respect that. As a story, I thought it was totally worth the asking price of $60. I mean, I have easily been recommending this to anyone I think might be interested. That being said, I kind of hope that there is a little bit more discussion as this goes on in terms of the plot holes it opens. I wonder if I'm the only one who sort of feels this way. So let me know what you guys think. If the plot holes sort of affected you, am I just overly kind of analyzing all of this? I'd be really interested to hear what other people think, because I pretty much have just been stuck in my head about this for the last like 2 months. Final little point I want to say, and this is just an obvious, amazing job on the music as well as all the English voice acting. The cast did such a great job. The soundtrack is just hauntingly beautiful. It finds ways of making kind of like almost horror mix well with frantic kind of electronic music that really just gets your blood flowing. There's not a single track on this entire soundtrack I thought felt out of place or just didn't do anything for me. It was just a instant classic. And I just have to give Vanillaware so much credit. Like, this might not be one of my favorite games of all time, but just from a studio that has just done so much with such a small staff in relative sense, going from stuff like Grim Grimoire, Odin Sphere, Muramasa, Dragon's Crown, and now with this, 13 Sentinels is just such an interesting, risky game that you just very rarely see. And I think for reasons that, like, even Vanillaware has been very forthcoming of, like, this is such a out there melding of genres and storytelling, and even just the cast alone, 13 playable characters to complete a story is no easy task for any game, let alone one that is like this. So I have nothing but respect for that whole team for making such an interesting game. And while nothing is flawless, I had no regret in terms of playing this game, platinuming it, and making this review, and hopefully having further discussions with everyone out there about it for years to come. Was easily one of my highlights in 2020, even though this is far from being my Game of the Year material. Either way, guys, thank you so much for sticking with me on this very, very long, different kind of review. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you thought of 13 Sentinels. Let me know if you enjoyed the story, who your favorite character is. Did you enjoy the gameplay? Either way, guys, I would love to talk even more about this game with all of you. And if you are craving even more 13 Sentinels conversation, I have a spoiler cast that will be going up shortly on this channel, all about it, that I will be linking in the description below once that is up and tweeting about online. Thank you all so much for listening to this review, and I will see you all later.